agree. Are you communicating with someone? You want to study where? What does that mean? I mean, what? You can do it. What time? I'll be there. You want to do something after? Okay. Oh, that's right. Okay.
I gave it a mention on one of past.
Let me hear it.
In class.
Okay, you don't want to give up your idea forever. I hear you.
Well, you might not approve it, I don't know.
Ooh. Well, now I'm really curious. Okay. All right, I'll wait for you at 3 and we'll chat.
Okay.
Anybody else got ideas thus far for their papers or their project?
I mean, I don't even have ideas for what I'm doing for tonight, so.
Wait a minute, it's in there.
When is
Oh, it's not due anytime soon. I'm just, if anybody's contemplating, yeah, you're a planner, so I feel you. I'm the same way. If I hear like I've got a paper due at the end of the semester, the brain starts working on what I might deal with later. So I'll send, you know, what I'll do is I'll send out the paper requirements maybe in the next day or so that you guys can start thinking about it. And that way you'll have plenty of time to work on it, think about it.
I don't do it for this, I'm gonna do it for something else.
Okay, I'm very curious to know what it is. Alrighty. It's never a good sign when a student says, you might not like it. It's always like an ominous thing. Yeah, I'm sure everybody's got 2 billion freaking things on their
Has everyone
plate.
gotten COVID tested?
I've already done one. I'm gonna do another one tomorrow for the help.
You better plan on long, I had a 1 o'clock appointment, I just left. It was the most disorganized.
Where did you go?
The SAC.
Oh, yeah, go to the SRC, the SAC's a shit show.
Tell people that they're doing the SRC.
Is there a deadline for that? Or?
Yeah, you have to have the test, you have to have the test around by 5
You
o'clock.
can do walk in at the SRC.
What's the enforcement gonna be if the students
I know.
that don't do this?
Okay, like,
Can I kick you out of class? Can I kick you out?
I just get what I'm told, so like, I'm told, like, in my classes, make sure my fellow students are getting COVID tested. That's the student leader, that's all I have.
Okay. I mean, I know you can't provide more than that. I'm just very curious what the universities will do, because I've heard everything from, you know, they'll try suspensions to nothing. And then if you say nothing, it's not me.
I mean, like, I low-key think I've already had it, I feel like I got tested. Because my boss last semester did the analytic test, and he had it while I was working there. So,
My girlfriend's mother, I think, had it. I had backed out of something in March. I'm assuming that was that.
yeah, probably.
Yeah. All right. Let's do this thing, team. It's 2:01. I know you guys love to hear me talk, and I love to hear me talk, so that means class has begun. So, how are we doing today? How was the weekend? Livable? Doable? It's important as we're all here.
The discussion board was fun.
Yeah, I actually read the posts thus far. They've all been very good. Make sure you're doing it. Make sure you're responding to each other. The more you talk on the discussion board, the better your discussion grade is, and it never hurts to have good grades. So, all good? Yes.
Are you like the type that like grades like within the time of the assignment being done, or like do you like wait till like the second to last day before the final and then like put them all in?
So like, if this is when the assignment is due, and this is the end of the semester, right there generally.
Are you serious? Because like, there's a form I can fill out too. And I'll tell you all how to fill out that form to get it back.
You know, that's how over a few years I've taught, that's how I've been, but this semester that shit's not gonna fly for the simple expedient that you guys need to know what you're doing, and I need to be more online this semester, so I will be much more online. Christian and Greg can tell you, I'm not the most Blackboard heavy, but this semester I'm gonna make myself be, so don't worry, you'll get grades back quickly. Alrighty, let's pick back up, where were we? Spanish conquests. If you're watching it later, guys, or if you're watching it online, I'm not sure you guys have used the online portal as much as the other class has. We're on Spanish conquests. So let's pick up the Spanish conquest then. Spain in the New World. Obviously, you know, one of the predicates here is that you can't really, we want to get to the U.S., right? We want to get to American history. At some point, we're going to get there. But you really can't divorce colonization as a European project without, you can't really discuss it without talking about some of the big ones. And frankly, you can't really talk about it without talking about Spain. Not only because the Spanish are the first to do it, but they are by far the most organized when they do it. As opposed to our later discussion of the English, especially the French, the Spanish have a natural advantage and have a very different conception of the soldier in terms of that conquest than the Americans will. In fact, the Americans don't even really think of it the same way, what we'll eventually consider the Americans. English colonists don't go there thinking of it as a conquest. They go there thinking of it largely as an economic tool. And we'll talk about that later. But the difference here is stark. So let's talk about Spain in the New World. What do you guys know about Spain in the New World, other than Columbus? Sailing that ocean blue. Disease. So generally, conquest in Spain by the Spanish is often broken down into 3 categories that Jared Diamond way too oversimplified. Guns, germs, steel. It's a useful shorthand because it's not all that untrue. In the end, the march of European conquest in North and South America, especially by the Spanish, is heavily dependent on the technological superiority of the Spanish themselves. For the simple fact, Spanish have steel weapons at a time where the average warrior, the Aztec or Mayan civilization was fighting with what kind of tool? This is a blade on most of their weapons. Obsidian stone, very good, which, as you might expect, simply does not cut through European plate armor. And in the end, the addition of horses and, of course, gunpowder is going to make their conquest significantly easier. But that is not to say, that it was solely a European project. In the end, almost all, not all, of the major Spanish conquistadors that we know of and that we would talk about do so with the help of native allies. And we're going to see this repeated again in North American warfare especially, is that one of the ways in which the various European countries are able to do what they do in terms of colonization is they tend to follow a divide and conquer mentality among the native tribes they run into. To pretend that the Europeans show up and are dealing with one central native tribe is not only wrong, it's deeply, deeply racist. If we forget the fact that there are a lot of different types of native tribes, native cultures, and native disagreements that far predate European intervention. So let's go backwards for just a brief second. When was North and South America generally settled? Go back way on the record. 12,000 years ago, right. Depending on which of the many markers you take, about 12,000 years ago is when the land bridge, Beringia, disappears under the waves. The big problem with understanding the differences between the New World and the Old, or Europe and North and South America, is we really have to conceptualize the differences between two very, very alien people. Not only have they not seen each other, and obviously not seen each other is an odd way to phrase it, there's been no contact for the better part of what? 12, 13, 14,000 years. What that means, beyond the simple lack of understanding of the two cultures, is what? What have not been built up in native bodies for the past 14,000 years? Immunities. The big problem here is the native societies are just absolutely decimated by diseases brought by European conquistadors. It's really one of the quirks of fate that it didn't go the other way. In the end, transmission of diseases from the Europeans to the natives in the New World is significantly more deadly than the opposite. What major transmissions of diseases followed back into Europe? Were there any? Syphilis is one of the bigger ones. Generally, it ends up being called first the Spanish disease because they brought it back from Europe, and then the French disease because the French, well, probably figured that out. The point of this is that the native immunities that simply do not cover things like smallpox and influenza are far more damaging to native communities than they are to the Spanish or to the French or the English. Depending on which estimate you take, there were between 10 250 million natives living in North and South America at the time of contact. Now, I tend to, obviously, as you might expect with numbers that are that error bar high, because there's no obvious written records to lead us to a real conclusion about the native numbers. The obvious answer lies somewhere in the middle. You would probably assume there was something in the neighborhood of 30 million natives stretched between North and South America. The conquest of these peoples, and the end, the dissolution of several major empires, especially by the Spanish, is done by a combination of overwhelming technological superiority, but more than anything, the suppression of native immunities and the march of death. This is something we'll come back to, especially as we talk about the North American problems. More often than not, over and over again, European observers would arrive at tribes that they had brief contact with, only to come back years later and find absolute decimation. Depending on what estimate you go with, as much as 90% of all natives who came in contact with the Europeans died of disease before ever there was military or political interaction.
Even a brief 100 years, without even firing an arrow, they killed millions.
A good example of this, very good, a good example of this, and obviously, at least initially, this was not on purpose. Later it will become on purpose. We'll talk about, what's his face? Jeffrey Amherst and the smallpox blankets in the Northeast. Generally, this was accidental. A good example of this was in Narragansett, in the northeast of North America, where English traders had accidentally met a native tribe, came back several years later to see them again, only to find they were all dead. And we're talking about a tribe of 15 to 16,000 people. It just disappeared. As you might expect, the dislocation that we're going to talk about with that is far more formative on the natives necessarily than it is on the Europeans.
So how they saw the native tribe decimated is kind of how like we saw one of our own settlements, with the Croatoan.
Yes, we'll talk about Roanoke. It's a little bit different. With Roanoke, they ascribed to more specific things. They were obviously confused about the disappearance of their lost colony. We'll talk about the lost colony a bit. Here, it's again tied up in that one context that we can't ignore, which is what? It's the one thing I said dominates European ideology. Religion. There is a distinct lack of understanding between the two cultures. For the Spanish, it's much easier for them to understand. A big part of why they'll eventually at least talk about why they conquer the Aztecs is a complaint about human sacrifice within the Aztec or Mayan cultures. Of course it was present, but using that as an excuse, as the Spanish do, negates the fact that we're dealing with very, very complicated, very, very powerful, and in some cases, very, very big native empires. We're not talking about small, dislocated tribes. We're talking about three of the most powerful empires the New World produced in its history. So let's start with the one that's probably the most well-known, the Aztec Empire. At its height, the Aztec Empire encompassed what is mostly central Mexico. It had what we would consider its tight hinterlands, and then we would have many, many native tribes in vassalage. Most of the vassalage did, in fact, involve captives being used for native sacrifices, or for human sacrifices. Depending on which estimate you take, some years the number of sacrifices may have totaled 20,000 a year. To support this, though, the Aztec Empire needed a constant demand of captives to make that work. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more you win, the more captives you bring in, the more you sacrifice. The Aztec Empire, at its height, when it met this man, was a very powerful empire. Who was our first conquistador? Our first big one. Which one? Hernan Cortez. Oh, I got my brace. Hernan Cortez. Very good. Cortez lands, the name needs spelling, lands in what is now central Mexico in the 1520s. And his journey inland takes him on a road to expedition that will a road to conquest. It'll be repeated several times. It'll be repeated against the Incas by this man who conquers the Incans. Francisco Pizarro conquers the Incas. The best way to think about this, the best way to put these all together, is that it kind of repeats the process. You have a small cadre of experienced Spanish soldiers, obviously and usually, typically, who take advantage of dissension or disagreements among the native cultures. Does anybody know how Pizarro does it? What big breakage in the Incan Empire he takes advantage of?
There's civil war.
Very good. There's a civil war between Atahualpa and his cousin, his brother, over who would control the Incan Empire. Pizarro sticks his way in there, and in the end takes advantage of both. One he ends up executing after forcing him to fill a room full of silver. Cortez does the same thing, but instead of preying upon an internal civil war, what does he act like in accordance with how the Aztecs initially saw him? He acts like a god, and the Aztecs, without any reference point for who he was, even if they didn't believe he was a god, which they almost certainly didn't, he certainly preyed upon their fears and their anxieties, as well as, far more importantly, preying upon their vassals. He used the concept of at least legitimizing or taking away some of the tribes that were used as human sacrificial pools, so to speak, for the Aztecs, and allied them, the most powerful being the Tlaxcala. Mexico City, or at least what was at one point Mexico City. Anybody know the name of the Aztec capital? Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was built on the edge of, or was built right on top of Lake Titicaca. A huge city at the time, far larger than anything that occurred in Europe. It was larger than London, larger than Paris, an absolute titanic city. Most of the time, though, Spanish who arrived could summarize their conquest goals in 3 simple words: gold, God, glory. 3 easy G's to remember. The obvious one is gold, right? What's gold in this scenario? Why did conquistadors show up on these shores? Why were they so willing to risk life and limb?
El Dorado?
El Dorado. The quest for gold. In some cases, depending on where you found it, it really did exist. There is no question. The Aztec and the Incan empires were fabulously wealthy. No question about it. The stories of El Dorado, the 7 cities of Cibola, stuff like that, those were mythological dreams. But there was very much, quite a bit of gold in these empires. In the end, it'll be the Spanish discovery of silver mines, particularly Potosi, that will lead to the Spanish Empire's conquest really meaning something long term. You can only exploit the natives so long before you got to find a way to keep the money growing. Next, God. What are we talking about here? And this is going to be a crucial component of the English in the New World as well.
Spread Christianity.
Spread Christianity. We have broken more. Conversion. Specifically, conversion of the natives to what you could consider, as we've already talked about in terms of the religious wars of Europe, to an understanding of the one true God. The Spanish, as opposed to the English and French, as we'll learn later, have a much easier time in terms of conversion, because they offer the natives a stark choice, and that's what?
Convert or die.
There it is. Couldn't say it better myself. Convert or die. There is no option here. The destruction of native religious structures, of native religious systems, is part and parcel of the conquest, for the simple expedient of what? What's the reason the Spanish target the Aztec religious structures?
Sacrifices.
One, simple revulsion at what they see as a very barbaric practice. Obviously, we need to point out that this is the exact same time as the Catholic Inquisition, and calling one group barbaric over the other is just absolutely asinine. More to the point, what else? Why would the Spanish Catholics attack the religion in particular? Control. Control, certainly. Let's add that one in. Conversion equals control. That's certainly a part of it. Greg? Yeah, in the end, it's about eradicating the native culture, and in this case, it's about eradicating a part of it that is essentially completely and utterly opposed to the Catholic understanding of one God, one religion. Catholicism at the time does not brook any dissension, right? That's the whole part of the Protestant problem, is Protestants themselves are seen as little better than heretics on the same level as the Mayans or the Aztecs or the Incans. Any dissension from the true faith is in fact heretical and must be repressed. It's a very easy system for them to find because what they show up and find is a polytheistic system that is completely alien to what they understand. And so the easiest answer for them is what? Destroy it and replace it with what they know. In the end, essentially what happens is once the Spanish are done destroying these empires, removing the systems that built them, they rebuild what you would consider a Spanish society in the New World, simply grafted upon the population that's already there, or what's left of it.
So would they land and then do these like big military campaigns, or would they land and go back and then come
So
back?
generally what happened was you would get these campaigns, it's hard to call them campaigns in the standard term. They obviously work, but more often than not, these guys, Pizarro, Cortez, Balboa, all of them, they were adventurers. They gathered bands of like-minded conquistadors and Spanish sailors, and they went looking for the cities of gold. After all, it was rumors of golden cities that actually got Cortez to show up on the shores of Mexico. He was a governor general in Cuba. He wasn't even sure there was an Aztec empire. The same with the Incas. These are essentially big old freebooter attempts in an attempt to find some gold. In the end, the big ones are the most well known, but there are plenty of expeditions of Spanish soldiers who go in looking for gold and find nothing. In fact, probably the most famous of these expeditions is Narvaez, who lands in South Florida looking for what? The Fountain of Youth. The expedition dies almost to a man. It's how Ponce de Leon dies as well. There's plenty of them that fail, but generally what we would call them are military adventurers working under the Spanish crown. In the end, they do in fact advance the Spanish Empire's assets, because what? Are these private fiefdoms? Or are these belong to the King and Queen of Spain? The second one. Generally how this worked was, say Cortez took the city of Tenochtitlan. Did Cortez keep all that money himself? No. He remitted some of it to the king and queen. He remitted some of it to his soldiers. He kept a big ass chunk for himself. Don't worry, they got rich doing it. However, more often than not, at the end of these things, what was left over were Spanish priests and Spanish administrators whose job it was to re-put together the country in Spain's image. So do we understand the Spanish conquests?
Well, why did they not just keep it?
Keep what?
The gold and live extravagantly without sending any back to Isabella?
What do you guys think? They would risk certain royal ire. After all, even if they were essentially independent freebooters, they still had to respect the fact that most of the resources they drew upon were Spanish resources. Unlike in England and France, when we talk about the conquest, or at least the colonization of the New World, where most of those were private ventures, these may have appeared as private ventures, but they were heavily subsidized by the fact that they have a crown back in Spain. You couldn't really separate them as much as they wanted to be separated. But as you might expect, Hernan Cortez traveling up and down Mexico in the 1550s, when news would get back to Isabella and Ferdinand, how long would that take? Several months, even years, which meant there was a big difference between what was actually handed back to Ferdinand and Isabella and what went in pockets. However, to answer your question, we need to answer the last G, glory. Glory in this sense isn't just glory in battle. It isn't just, look at me, I'm a knight.
Become heroes to their own country.
Yes, because many of these men do what after their conquests? They go home. The Spanish conquistadors, the rich ones, the ones who made their money, didn't make their money so they stayed in the New World. They made their money and went back. They went back to Spain, bought haciendas and villas, bought titles, became big, glorious men. That, in the end, is part of the reason that they don't want to just betray the crown, because the crown is what gives them titles. It's what gives them land. It's what changes them from little adventurers to landed magnates. And in the end, that's more important than gold. Not that they didn't get plenty of both. Make sense? Yes, exactly. It is better for them to be very powerful landed magnates of a king than it is to set themselves up as native potentates.
Yeah, pretty much.
Make sense? Good question, very good question. All right, so we feel like we understand the temper of the Spanish conquest. Let's play a game. This one's fun. Have you guys played this, you and you? This look familiar at all? Let's play a game. This one you guys will take a nice airing break. So, like I'm trying to explain to you, there is a vast diversity in native cultures across North and South America. What you're going to do, I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about it, is tell me whether you think each one of the identified slides or each one of the identified pieces is in North or South America. If you get all 5 right, I'll give you a bonus point. If you miss one, you get nothing. Got it?
Oh, jeez, man.
I know, I'm awful. So, let's do it.
How do we do this?
So here's what's going to happen. Each one of you is going to tell me your name. I'm going to write it. I'm going to write 1 through 5 across this, and you're going to think about those answers while I write all that stuff down. So I'll just start here. Name? John. Next? Tess. Next?
Paul.
Paul. Next?
Jared.
Huh?
Jared.
Jared.
When you say bonus point, what do you mean?
Like a big ass bonus point. It's like 1%
Percent of the final grade?
of your final grade.
What the, what?
No, it's 1/2%. Your grade is 200 points total, so it's 0.5% of your grade. Think about it. I give out bonus points like candy. A couple of those can really knock you over a line somewhere. Jared, who's next?
They really do.
You know,
Me? Ryan.
right?
I didn't know you were pointing to me.
No, you're fine. Next,
Kyle,
Kyle, Greg,
with a Q.
Brett, correct. Christian, who I got left? Yeah.
Dom.
What?
Dom.
Dom?
Yeah.
Cool. Dom again. All right, cool. Don't worry, guys. This is how I get names. I'm not the best at names, but I get them eventually. It's harder with masks. Maybe I'll say that. All right, start thinking. So number 1, number 2. Remember, you just have to tell me whether or not it's in North or South America. That's all I need from you. Make sense? All right, I'll give you guys like a minute to think. Sound good? No Googling, no bullshit. Just think.
How are we gonna Google this?
I don't know. Did Professor Goldberg already do this 18,000 times? Yes, he has. I've only ever had, I used to do this in groups. Obviously, we're not going to do it in groups today. I've only ever had 2 groups get this right. It's very difficult.
Are you gonna tell us after each one?
Nope, I'll tell you at the end. You guys ready? Yep. John, 1, North or South?
I'm gonna go contrarian. I'm pretty sure it's south, but I'm gonna say north.
All right.
I'll be contrarian.
Tess, North or South? South. Paul? South. Jared? North. Ryan?
Looks like, this is really difficult for me. I'm actually kind of on the fence.
That's okay. I can come back to you if you want.
Yes, please.
Okay. Kyle?
Clive.
North.
Greg?
North.
Christian?
North.
Dom?
North. I think it looks like south, though.
Okay. John, number 2.
I'm gonna say north again.
Okay. Tess? Okay. Paul?
North.
Jared?
North.
Ryan?
North.
Okay. Ryan, have you felt about number 1 yet? That's okay if you're not.
Yeah.
Kyle?
North.
Greg?
North.
Christian?
North.
Dom? North, you said?
Yep, north.
Number 3, John?
North.
Tess? Paul?
North.
Jared?
North.
Ryan?
North.
Kyle?
North.
Greg?
North.
Christian?
North. And north.
All right. You must feel real confident on that one, do you? 4, John?
I'm gonna keep saying north. You would put the next one too if you want.
Sure. Tess?
South.
Paul?
North.
Jared?
North.
Ryan?
South? I don't know.
Kyle?
South.
Greg?
This is for 4?
4.
North.
Oh, crap.
Oh.
I was looking at the wrong one.
Oh, no, sorry.
Wait.
My bad.
I was looking at number 5.
Tess? Yep, North. Paul, you're okay with North? Jared, you're okay with North?
Yeah.
Ryan, are you okay with it?
Let's change it to north, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Same with you, Kyle?
North too.
Okay, you guys are all cowards for changing it. Just teasing. Christian?
I also think they're all North American.
Oh, Okay.
North.
Feeling confident. Okay. North or Dom? All right. 5. We stick with north? All right. South. Paul.
South.
Jared.
North.
Ryan.
North.
Ryan, you want to give me number 1?
North.
Okay.
Come back to me.
Okay. Skip you, Greg.
South.
South. Christian, north still?
Yeah.
Dom?
North.
Okay. All right. I need an answer from just you, Kyle.
Yeah, south.
South. All right.
Did anybody get it right?
Yep.
South.
All right. Number 1. Where are we? North or South America?
Looks like it's in Mexico.
It is indeed. This is Chichen Itza in the Yucatan Peninsula, North America.
Yes. I've been there.
Easy. So, do we lose anybody? I'm so sorry, Tess and Paul.
Ouch.
It's rough. It happens, though. It happens. 2. Where are we? North America, where?
Southwest.
Southwest. This is Arizona.
I was thinking Arizona.
It's the Pueblo
Yeah.
people in Arizona.
It looks like Nevada or
Very-
Colorado.
It is. It's out west. This is specifically the Pueblo or Anasazi culture in North America, in Arizona.
Wait, did
3.
we lose anybody there?
Like the Great.
Did we lose anybody on that one?
No.
Nope. Everybody got north there. Number 3. Looks like you all picked north.
Definitely north.
Where in the north?
Like the Great.
There's a plains. Very good. Plains in
Indian
the
area.
1500s in North America, Kansas, wherever. 4.
It's like New England, I think.
Very good. This is what we would call the Algonquin or one of the Northeast tribes. Very good. All north. You guys all got both of those. Some dissension here, it seems. Number 5. Where is this?
Mississippi.
Yeah, it's
Close.
in the mountains.
Very close. It is, in fact, North
Yeah,
America,
the mountains.
which means John,
Oh, shit.
Jared, Ryan,
Yeah. I paid attention in 8 foot.
and Christian, and Dom all got it.
I remember.
That's a high proportion. I'm not doing it with 300 level anymore.
I remember seeing something about. the
Where is
river
this?
that-
Anybody?
Like the Minnesota River. That's
It's about
River
about-
Valley or something.
about a 2-hour drive from here.
Tennessee?
Cahokia, Illinois.
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 Really?
This is one of the mound builder
I
cultures.
remember.
At the height of this city-state, which was largely a corn-based city-state, probably 40,000 people lived in Cahokia. Much, much bigger and often much, much different than you might expect.
I remember seeing a documentary on.
You guys doing okay back there? You good?
Yeah.
Hey, you guys good?
Okay.
What's the point of this exercise other than for me to just throw out bonus points?
To demonstrate how many different cultures there are.
Very good. If the diversity is so inherent in just North America, we need to understand then that when we start talking about the native cultures, specifically as they relate to the English and as the French, it is very, very reductivist if we don't understand them as a very, very myriad group of cultures. To pretend, as often happens in American history classes, the natives can be treated as a singular entity is a bad way to do it. Not only is it bad, it's inherently wrong. There's far too much diversity amongst the native tribes themselves than to treat them as a single set structural group. Does that make sense?
It's like classifying all modern Americans as the same thing.
Exactly. For the same reason that we as modern Americans understand there's a vast difference between us as Kentuckians, whatever the hell happens in Indiana, there's a lot of diversity within these tribes.
Try Florida.
Or Florida, well, it's not even there.
What the hell
So
is
would these
Florida?
like adventures, military people, would they recognize that difference?
No.
In the same way, we would struggle even as modern Americans to figure out where some of these groups are. Now, you guys did a hell of a job with this. Just think about how hard it would have been for a 15th century conquistador to ever try to do this. Or more to the point, why would they try to do this?
They're just gonna destroy it.
Right. We have to see that not only are these cultures in competition, European and the native, many of the native cultures are in competition or outright warfare with each other, even within the same tribal identities. There was significant conflict that predated European involvement. One of the things we're going to concentrate on, though, especially as it relates to the American settlement patterns, is the fact that these warfare systems for the natives were very, very different from the European. Because remember, what is the one thing I keep saying over and over again in terms of what produces war?
The culture.
Culture produces war. Ergo, we need to understand that there are a variety of different cultural inputs in native warfare that make it very different from the European culture that we've been discussing, right? If we talk about how European military systems are born from very different technology, very different society, very different modes and interpretations, we definitely then understand automatically, is that also the case for the natives? Absolutely. So good job, guys. If you've gotten a bonus point, poke me after class, because I always forget who gets bonus points. And that's just a truism for the whole class. If I say bonus point, remind me at the end of class or I will forget. Okay, now let's get on to the heavy stuff. Let's get our mind around why the English show up in the first place. Part of the issue here, part of the deep set issue in understanding the roots of the United States is a misinterpretation of why the hell we showed up in the first place. Now, part of this has to do with a lot of things that we know in this country. We tend to mythologize the parts that were bad, and we tend to overemphasize the parts that were good. Therefore, in a class like this, where you guys are upper level students, you understand these things at a more fundamental level, let's just deal with the truth, okay? First and foremost, why did the English, in a variety of different reasons, come to the New World? Let's talk about them.
Money.
One, economic opportunity.
Primogeniture?
Yes, let's just leave that one in economic opportunity. You're right. It's often the second sons and the third sons that come to the New World. They lack the ability to inherit dad's wealth. A problem I'm sure all children have. But more to the point, it's economic opportunity. We'll talk about what exactly in a minute.
Religious.
Religious dissension.
Purity.
Very good. We'll talk about this one in more detail because this one requires some clarification. Any other reasons?
Would it be like getting a better status, like their own land and getting status?
Social loosening is a better way to think of it. Very different systems will pop up in the New World than that are already established in Europe. Now, of course, as you might expect, because they are essentially proto-European systems, they're largely descended from these same European systems. However, you're right, there are fundamental differences, many of which are part of obtaining better social status. After all, to use an easy example, George Washington did not consider himself a Virginian first. What did he consider himself?
A British.
A British subject. He considered himself an upper-class British subject living in Virginia. Before he considered himself a Virginian, certainly before he considered himself an American. Before that idea even existed, these men and women wanted to increase their social status as it related back to the main empire. Very good. This is a good three. What do you got?
Before, the idea of American was really accepted, being called an American was tantamount to an insult.
Exactly, and we'll absolutely talk about that since it's in most ways that most Americans tend to forget. It's tied up in a military campaign. It's the British and the Americans struggling both with and against each other. And during the 7 Years' War, it really highlights the differences between the two groups that have grown apart over several hundred years of colonization. So let's start. Where do you guys want to start? North, central, or down south? North.
Yeah, the bulk started up north.
Let's start with two. Let's start with the religious underpinnings of the northeastern colonies, better known in this case as the New England colonies. The New England colonies are absolutely established out of an interest in religious freedom, but we should understand they did not mean religious freedom. They meant religious freedom for whom?
Protestant.
Themselves, only themselves. Let's talk about the Puritans, as they are often held up as kind of the ideal American colonist, right? They're often shown as this picture of American colonial domesticity. The problem with that image is obvious and is deeply manifest in how we treat the Puritans. One, when they left England, did they leave on good terms? No, absolutely not. They were quite literally harried out of England. They went where? Holland. Why Holland? What in the hell would they be doing going to Holland? It's a good guess, though. It's a very good guess. What was Holland known for at the time?
More tolerant.
It was the most tolerant of the European religious or in terms of religion in Europe at the time. It was a much more polyglot, much more religiously plural, and even then, did the Dutch have a problem with them?
Yes.
Yes, let's make this clear. It wasn't because the Puritans were super cool people that everybody wanted to chill with. They were religious fanatics. Let's make that clear. The entire ideology, the entire ideology of Puritanism was that the English church was not pure enough. It allowed far too many things that they saw as problematic. English weren't praying enough. They weren't attending church enough. They weren't telling their women to shut up enough. There were so many wrapped up problems that Puritanism promoted in terms of fighting against English Anglicanism that they were persona non grata. They quite literally had to flee to the New World, not because the authorities at home were intolerant, but because who was intolerant? The Puritans themselves. We'll see this again and again. Whenever people would shipwreck during the colonial era and end up in New England by accident, what was the first thing the Puritans did to them? Told them to get out. They sent them south over and over again. They were simply, no matter who they were not worthy to be in Puritan society. They were not Puritan. So what we tend to think of in American history as American religious tolerance really actually comes from a lack of tolerance. As you might expect, as we explore the colonization of New England, will that intolerance impact the native tribes they meet with? Of course.
So basically, suppose that a relative got kicked out of their house for, I don't know, being too sloppy or something like that. Say, hey, can I crash here? My parents kicked me out. And then you're like, yeah, sure. And then you realize why they got kicked out. I'm like, okay, dude, you gotta go. You're messing this place up.
It's a good way to think about it. In a lot of ways, the Puritans kind of represent one of those mythologized parts of American history, right? The idea that we've taken religious tolerance and hidden it behind a very sanitized view of a group that was so intolerant, even the freaking Dutch wouldn't let them hang out for too long, which at the time is saying a lot. Because does anybody know what two groups the Dutch were generally more okay with than the Puritans?
The Catholics.
Jews and Muslims. In the 15th century Holland, they were cooler with two groups they considered straight up heretics than they were with Puritans. That should tell you about the religious implication of that.
So did the crown help them?
No, they had to rent their own boats and get the hell out themselves. And that is, again, one of the defining markers of English colonization is, despite where it comes from, they're all private ventures. Very good question.
What about private ventures?
All of the attempts at English colonization, regardless of whether it's Puritan or as we'll talk about the middle colonies, or whether we'll talk about it in the Caribbean colonies, they're essentially funded by private individuals, even if they have, and they almost always have, royal permission. There's a big gap between royal permission and royal paying. And the English government of the period was broke, and there's no getting around it. Part of the reason it was broke is for the same reason we've already discussed. It was dealing with its own stuff. The English Civil War, in fact, not only interferes with colonization on multiple points, but the reason the lost colony is lost is because Sir Walter Raleigh, who promised the lost colony that he would come back, got stuck and thrown in jail during the middle of the Civil War and never came back. And so when they came back 4 years later, as opposed to the promise 12 months later, they were gone. Part of the problem is European actions, specifically European military actions, often had a hand in colonial policy. We'll see this again and again. So let's talk about the middle colonies then. Do we understand the Northeast? I'm going very fast, so if you guys tell me to slow down, I'm happy to. The middle colonies.
Dutch.
Let's stick with the English. The middle colonies are certainly, at least initially settled, or at least the northern ones. New York was officially what before it was New York? New Amsterdam. Very good. It was a Dutch settlement. In fact, they're not only Dutch settlements. Who's the other European power to get involved in the New York River Valley? Not one. We almost always forget about it in American history. Swedes. The Swedes had significant Swedish population in the New England or New York River valleys. Odd enough, but it happened. More to the point, the middle colonies, let's consider them as the Chesapeake colonies. Where's the Chesapeake? What modern states are we talking about? Virginia and Maryland. That's not what Maryland's. What is Maryland? MD. Thank you. Total. No idea. All right. Virginia and Maryland. Virginia and Maryland, the same reason that colonists show up there is the same reason colonists show up in Mexico and in South America. They're looking for what? Gold. The idea was, if you read the old colonization requests, we'll talk about it, the indenture contracts in a bit, over and over it's mentioned, all you need to bring is a shovel and a strong back, because you'll be picking gold up off the ground. What the hell are you making that up for? Obviously, they did not find any gold. There was no 7 cities of Cibola in Virginia. It took a long time and a lot of dead colonists, particularly from the flu, particularly from malnutrition, over and over from starvation, before they realized that what is the real moneymaker in the Chesapeake colonies? Tobacco. This is one of those times where we talk heavily about economic opportunity. And we need to understand the underpinnings of the economic system because it will deeply impact the American social system of the next few decades. More often than not, the average person who came over was white and came over through the indenture system. What is the indenture system? As you can see, this is an indenture contract right here. I got a hand, I'm throwing a hand.
Sorry, you would work for X amount of years, and once you finish that, you would get land.
Very good. How many years was the typical indenture contract? Very good. 7 years was the typical indenture contract. This is why the social underpinnings of the colonies were generally poor. Because you could not afford your own way over, you entered in an indenture contract with those who were already there. Basically what happened was the richer people who had come over and settled large tracts of farmland still needed labor. And this is going to be the consistent problem with the American colonies, is the lack of available labor. Why was labor so lacking? Some of it is there simply is just not enough bodies to go around. Why is the problem stay so consistent? What is the deal with Virginia and Maryland? Y'all ever been there?
Yeah.
It's hot. It kills a lot. Heavily pestilential. Depending on who you ask, 1 in every 2 English colonists who arrived between 1600 and 1650 died. Period. 1 in every 2. As you might expect, those numbers do not lend themselves to what? Sustained colonization? More to the point, what is the one thing that's probably not happening in significant numbers when your population is underfed, overworked, and largely, as you might expect from the number of workers needed, is largely male? Low birth rates. Extremely low birth rates mean that for the colonies to sustain themselves, they need constant what? Replenishment of immigration. Exactly. This is why the indenture system lasts as long as it does. Because there's one thing that's deeply abundant in the New World, and there's one thing that's deeply lacking. What's the abundant thing? Land. There is an infinite amount of land. All you need to do is take it from those who are already there, or barter it from them, or buy it from them, or whatever. Land can be had. What cannot be had in enough numbers is what? Labor. And so, English colonization in the middle colonies is driven by this constant need to keep churning out fresh bodies. And in so doing, it establishes a pattern of colonization that you can obviously see from the map. And that's what? It's very easy to understand English colonization on every level. It's deeply, deeply what? Look at the map. Tell me what you see. It's coastal. It's deeply tied to the fact there needs to be some sort, I'm just going to keep writing words all over the damn place. It's deeply, deeply tied to the fact that you can only go inland when you have enough what? People to make the system keep going. And so, as we'll talk about it probably more likely on Wednesday, what we generally see is the concentration of military and population resources on the coast, and then a slow movement of the frontier. Slowly but surely, west. And so this is essentially very first peek at what we'll see later in this class as America continues to move west. It's heavily influenced by one thing and one thing only: demographics. In the end, the English, the French, the Spanish, particularly the English, will find that conquest is wrapped up in the ability to put more bodies on the ground than anyone else. The English in particular, largely because once this labor problem eases and more women arrive on these shores, once there is a much higher birth rate, what in the end is necessary? Constant expansion. The story of the United States, after all, at least up until 1880, is what? Westward movement. What is the last state in the contiguous 48 states to be settled? Oklahoma. But that's because Oklahoma got backfilled. All the other states were a western push, a westward push. This starts here. It starts small. It starts small because it's demographically small. And as we'll see, a big difference, and we'll return to it on Wednesday, is that unlike the Spanish, who arrived as soldiers with military experience from the wars of religion, particularly the Reconquista, what's the difference here with these groups? Did they come with military experience? Did the Puritans come with military experience? No. Does your average indentured laborer come with military experience? No. What you have instead of the Spanish setup is you have a huge number of amateurs. And so, in the end, this is why the militia system in the US develops much more clearly than it will in the Spanish Empire. There's simply no corresponding military force that can enforce this westward expansion. And so as we'll see, especially on Wednesday, we'll look at the underpinnings of the military system itself. It's 2:50. I think that's a great stopping spot. I don't want to say like I nailed it, but I kind of nailed it. So any questions, guys? All right, I'll see you on Wednesday. Yes. Give me 2 seconds.
Yep.